everyone, this is Callie from Telltale Poetry, and I'm so excited to reconnect with J.D. Scott. J.D. is the author of Moonflower, Nightshade, All the Hours of the Day, and now books, and a debut short story collection. Sorry, that's the debut short story collection, which won the 2018 Madeline P. Plonker Emerging Writers Residency Prize. That's a mouthful. Their debut poetry collection, Mask for Mask, is what we're going to be talking about today, and it's forthcoming from New Rivers Press in 2021, and it's freaking awesome. Scott has authored 2 poetry chapbooks, won a bajillion prizes, published in Hayden's Ferry, Nine Letters, Salt Hill, Sonar Review, The Pitch, Spoon River Poetry Press, How Fast Can I Talk, and elsewhere. And they've been featured in Best American Experimental Writing and Best New Poets. Scott's accolades include being awarded a Lambda Emerging LGBTQ Voices Fellowship, congrats, attending the Poetry Foundation's inaugural Poetry Incubator, and being awarded residencies at some places that y'all probably want to go to, like the Malay Colony, the Edward F. Albee Foundation, and Writers at the Erie. Scott holds an MFA from the University of Alabama, where they edited and designed for Black Warrior Review. Welcome to Telltale.
I'm so glad to be here with you this morning, Callie. Thank you for having me and taking the time to talk to me.
Well, you know, it's funny. When I first reached out, we have a new process for interviewing, and usually it's just like a video series that you would answer, but I fell in love with this book.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, there are bodegas, plastic bags, drunk partners, Bellini, tarot references, and like a shit ton of blood. And this collection is like so delicious, so bizarre, and it's held together by this like singular, unruly voice, which I love. So I just want to congratulate you on this brilliant collection, and ask you to read a poem from it, and maybe the poem you like the least.
The poem I like the least. That's a really interesting question. I feel like maybe one of the shorter poems, and maybe one of the ones I thought about cutting, but ultimately kept in. Sure, I'll read Tribulation. It's a shorter poem in the book. Strange in its own way. A tribulation. All night the hustlers move through my room, slapping me awake. They sing, "My love is a K-hole," which topped the charts in a year not unlike this one. Are all my lovers as sleepy-headed? In the bed, the word bed looks like a bed. In bed, I tell everyone my air mattress is actually water. Let their imaginations toil. I lie Savasana style, wearing a 3-piece suit. I pray for salvation. I push Benadryl ghosts off the edge of my sheets over and over with pixelated hands. Insomnia's a complicated act, like dining on a birthday cake of arteries, or inversely, all the chambers of the heart filled with barbecue sauce. Meat and melatonin. My desiderata keeps this room glued. My one tag is tied to my toe, my big toe, and I am cold. Someone keeps stealing the good half of the blanket. Outside, another dawn comes with swollen fingers, with 8-bit blips. I drift. My hustler, the one I possess and haunt, my favorite, pulls the curtain back. He sings, "There goes the rapture." Beyond my window, there are piles of vests and dresses, neckties, sad, sad scarves. Something is happening in the sky. The hustlers stick an ice pick into the air mattress. A tide of saliva flows, then a spinning hiss, like tires rolling out of a laundromat.
Thank you. I want to actually, that's a good poem to bring this up. But in Goth Jams, you wrote, "If I don't hold on to the cruel dentistry of words, I'd be left alone in the language of me, or worse, left alone in the language of you." And throughout this collection, there seems to be words that get unraveled. So knickknacks become monstrous, become my own monstrous continents. And there's so much fun and joy and a lot of incantation. And I wanted to hear a little bit about your relationship with language in this collection.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this collection really is based on creating a type of language. And I think a lot of that is based on, one of my, if I had to sort of talk about some sort of sense of poetics, I'd say embracing play is really important, and not necessarily feeling like legibility is my this goal at the top of the hierarchy. I feel like there are a lot of ways that we're taught to write a poem or communicate what a poem is. There is some dramatic turn at the end, right, for something. And I think even this poem, I mean, it doesn't super have a dramatic turn. It doesn't necessarily have a moral or a lesson. It's kind of a strange reflection on the rapture from sort of Christian New Testament belief, and also all the other themes that are working in this book, like relationships with love and relationships with men and sort of other sort of emotive themes. But I think I sort of embraced a type of language making where I didn't necessarily feel as if uh, I had to tell it straight every time to my reader. And I think a lot of that, I mean, I also have a background in visual arts. And, when you go into a museum and you look at a painting, you often just bring what you have to look at that painting and experience it. And sometimes you hate it, sometimes you don't get it, sometimes you're frustrated, but you still come to that experience or come out of it with something. And, I think reading a poem can sometimes be looking at a painting in a museum. It doesn't necessarily have to always be a teachable moment, a lesson, this poetic volta, this turn, this moral of the story, something that clues you into some insight of the universe. I don't think every poem has to do that. And I think I was sort of resisting a lot of that in the book with my language making.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I actually kind of liken that to film. There's a lot of different styles of film, and some of them have morals, some of them have kind of, you might even call them points, right? Where you can kind of directly tell this narrative. But kind of exploring language and exploring poems in this way leads me to another question, which is, if there is such a playfulness around language and this sense, what is your editing process like? And can you take us through maybe a different incarnation of these poems?
And it's tough because I'm not someone who meticulously version tracks. Although it's actually interesting that what I just said is not true, because I mean, and I'm sure this is probably interesting to some of your Telltale viewers, is I had over 20 different versions of this manuscript. It's shifted and changed many times. Many poems fell out, fell in, came back. One of the poems, I think you even sort of, when you were introducing me, you sort of said some keywords you had pulled from poems. One of them, Night Errands, in the early part of the book, I did publish, and I had a chapbook called Night Errands. So the poem actually had a different name in the chapbook, but I think it was the only poem from this chapbook I pulled. So I ended up just maybe calling it the name of the chapbook as an homage. And it's probably the most Night Errands poem. I mean, I don't know. It's like 15, 16 lines. I don't know. Do you want me to read both of them, or just loosely talk about what I see changing?
Well, what I'll do is I'll actually share the screen where I have Mask for Mass open, and I will show the kind of the new version.
Perfect.
You can just see night errands, right? You can't see my.
Right.
Cool.
Yeah, I can just see the PowerPoint. I mean the after that document. So
Perfect.
that's perfect. So yeah, I can. This is, I think this is not one with dramatic change, but I think it'll be interesting to see the difference. So at the end of Night Errands, it's a very small chapbook. There's different moments in time in New York and other cities. So, and my cat's talking a lot. Faust, no. so, this poem was originally called Faust. No. So, I mean, if he'll just be in the background.
Faust wants to be famous. Come on, Faust. You can come on.
Yeah, he's already a famous cat amongst, I feel like, my writer friends, as someone who is very vocal. So this poem was originally called 11 p.m. in Williamsburg, and then I mean that's, so there's one thing I changed the title. So here's the first version. This is the night of unreasonable errands. Bodega incense burns, air is cleansed. What little science made it cold again, created crop circles with plastic bags on the pavement. This religion is new, crafted from each direction the curtain shakes. The smoke alarm does his deeds heroically. Burnt sage's wisdom, a knight errant. What transactions go on at this hour? What very thing did the body define? This train, elevated train, is a ghost train, ghost story. This third story apartment will confuse backfire for fireworks, fireworks for stars. The bishop moves side to side and does so with an ounce of good in his wooden heart. This is how New Year's are ushered in, the unknowable weight in the plastic bag.
Thank you. Wow. So a lot of it changed.
Yeah, I guess at a lot of the second half.
Yeah, the second half is totally different. I like, yeah, you made the change to walk-up apartment from third story apartment. Remind me again, instead of what answer did the bundled herbs find, what did you have there before?
What transactions go on in this hour? What very thing did the body define?
Very thing. It's really interesting. I love seeing these side by side and thinking about the decisions you made. But I think what's interesting is when we see a collection like yours, in a beautiful press, like the press that published you, I think a lot of people think, oh, it just, it didn't take a lot of effort. And I know that in your collection, you talk about the fact that this was sort of 20 years in the making, I think you said. And
right. Yes and no. I started kind of engaging with poetry in the early 2000s. I don't think I started really taking things seriously until like the early 2010s. But this book was certainly like a 10-year process, more or less.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because when we say 10 years, can you talk a little bit about what that was like? I mean, were you working on this every day? Where did you have a schedule? Like, what was your situation and relationship?
I think for a few years, no. I sort of wrote in the moments. I wrote in the gap, and I didn't also necessarily feel I feel like I had a lot of poems. I feel like I was sitting on a lot of poems, but I didn't necessarily feel like I had a book within me. But it was something I feel like it was, and I'm not saying that I'm a courageous person, but I think it is a courageous act to sit down and print all your poems out. And I made the first draft. It has a subtitle. It's the Everything But the Kitchen Sink draft, and I literally print out like over 100 pages of poetry. It was everything I didn't hate. Maybe it was close to 120, which is a really substantial poetry book. And then from there, I think it was ordering those as if it was a book, and the kitchen sink version, and then kind of going from there and being a little bit more editorial, and sort of moving through process. Something about Night Errands is it's really, I'd say in a certain way, it's less persona, it's less voice driven in terms of this a sort of performance. So when I write a poem called 11 p.m. in Williamsburg, I mean, that's when I lived in Brooklyn. That's sort of based on my life. But I think something that came out with the process of Mask for Mask is it feels very fictionalized. It often feels fantastical or strange or out of this world. And I wanted to decenter that. So that's one of the reasons the poem changed, because if I call it Williamsburg, suddenly I'm placing that poem in Brooklyn. There's other small things, even just as we went through this, I remember where I changed something in the first stanza to Anthora cups, which are those sort of famous, those cheap Greek pattern, plastic coffee or styrofoam coffee cups you get in New York. And I did that because the final couplet uses plastic bag, and I didn't want that to appear twice, because I wanted the language to be sort of surprising and constantly refreshing itself. And sort of other things. I did live in a third-story apartment, and that felt, So I think I maybe as a sort of personal cleansing, I tried to remove some of the non-fictional components from this book, because it is supposed to be strange, and it is supposed to feel grounded in our reality. It is supposed to feel like it's not like a speculative poetry. I mean, it is taking place on our earth, but and there are hints. I mean, I do mention brand names sometimes. There's certain themes that go through, like class and classism and luxury, and low class versus high class, and lowbrow versus highbrow. And I think there's choices you make as you go through the book, especially as you start seeing patterns, which you either embrace and lean into harder, and you're like, okay, well, there's a word, like you said, there's a lot of blood, and so if there's blood, or someone else said there's a lot of red, so it's one of those things when you're like, oh, there's a lot of red, well, maybe I can lean into that harder, or certain things where you want it to feel consistent, but not, I feel like that you also don't want to fully reveal your trick. Like, I also reference, Lot's wife from the Bible like 3 times, but then I was like, I said Lot's wife 3 times, so then it's like, oh, but then in one part I call her Edith, and another part I sort of reference this woman made of salt. And so I feel like there's different ways you can play with these sort of echoes and reverberations and repetitions in other poems, and because you once you start honing in and getting down to what is the manuscript, I think and you're like reading through this entire book length object at once, you notice these patterns, and you start to have some sense of self-governance or agency of which patterns you're going to change and reject, or which one you're going to embrace and lean into harder. I know it was a very long answer. I hope that's useful.
No, that's really useful. I love this idea of like thinking about them as patterns, and also the book as object, because I think a lot of times when people are editing, it's hard to create that distance. And it's clear that when you were going through this editing process, you did separate yourself emotionally a little bit from the poems in order to create this this object that kind of fits into this world. And it reminds me a lot of how someone crafts fiction. And I know you write fiction, so I wanted to hear like your relationship to fiction and your relationship to poetry, and how do you know when you're about to sit down and write a poem versus a fictional piece, and do you?
That's a really excellent question. I think my relationship with this is always changing. I think I used to think of myself as like a poet first and foremost, and maybe I still do. But I think I don't think I really realized how narrative my poetry was. It was something, I mean, it is sort of a lyric, and it is experimental, and where I use complicated language in certain ways, or it's not always legible. But at the same time, I think a lot of these poems are telling a sort of story, their narrative incapacity. And that's something that, I mean, I'll talk a little bit more about the stories, but I think that's tough too, because the poems in Mask for Mask, I mean, this is not necessarily a singular story. The voices that move from poem to poem aren't necessarily the same sort of voice or persona, but that's I think that's a natural thing you have to account for, is that someone's going to read this as a type of narrative or singular story, or even perhaps trying to figure out how you, the author, which I think is a poetry problem, maybe it's a fiction problem too, but certainly with poetry, right, trying to conflate the voice in the poems with the author. And I mean, so certainly there was an effort to distance that and remove that. But I think I did, that's something I really resisted at first, that this book is a story and it's going through a story. And at some point I leaned in it a little bit harder, and sort of figured out a way to maybe try to make sense of all the material and order it. Um,
And where
which I
did
think
that,
that's a, well, yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, where do you think that resistance came from?
I guess because there isn't a consistent story. I think I use these techniques to flatten, where it's sort of, I mean, men appear in this book as sort of villainous and violent, and of course there are non-fictional components behind it, but that's not necessarily what I'm interested in doing in this book. But I worry that someone's going to think this is like a book about one person that I'm writing about, like that JD, the author, is writing about like one real person. And I think there's an anxiety that people are going to like misinterpret my work, or think it's a puzzle that I'm, that things are hidden in a way on purpose. And I also don't think work that might be challenging or require a little more time is always meant to puzzle you, or meant to sort of, the author is messing with you and trying to make you do more work. I mean, I think it's oftentimes some of us, we don't always have the same language, especially people who are neurodivergent. You're right. We don't always have the same one universal shared language. And I kind of resist that idea too, that we should all be using whatever, I feel like certain times when you see popular poems, you're like, I love this, and this is my voice now. And it's not your voice, right? I mean, I don't think we should, but I think there are sometimes also subtle signals where it's like, okay, well, this person's doing really well, this person's publishing, winning all the awards, so maybe if I can make my voice a little more like theirs. And I mean, I'm not trying to make a statement about, where poetry is in 2021, but I think sometimes I saw what was popular, and I saw my own work, and I'm like, I'm doing something that's not always hitting these same notes. And I think maybe as part of that is also just making peace with what I'm doing, and realizing it's not what, a lot of other poets are doing.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I think that also, what you said about, you find these patterns and you either lean into it or you kind of go against it, and being able to look at your own work and say, yeah, it's not necessarily like, and maybe it's not even a little bit like what other people are doing. And like you said, it's not necessarily like this puzzle. But I think that the interesting thing is, like, when you have a puzzle, right, it's all those pieces, they come together, they form this thing. It's not always what you expected necessarily, but they all line up. And I think your work is really interesting. Like I said, I was surprised. One of my favorite books I've read in the past year. And I read a lot of books. And I think sometimes, like you said, there are these notes in contemporary poetry always, right, that become popular, or these themes or ideas or concepts. And I think your work is really interesting because of the way you play with language, and because of the way you shift language. And I don't necessarily view it as it's not like language poetry necessarily, because right, there is still a narrative, it's still grounded in space. But I thought that was really interesting. And you mentioned too about, we see these poets that are winning awards and getting published, but I noticed a lot of this collection was published. Can you talk a little bit about your strategy, or what your experience with the submission process was like?
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important, I'm glad you asked that. And I think that's something too, is that I mean, I think talking of, especially, I mean, I know a lot of people who might be watching this are sort of, starting to send work out. And I think, gosh, I sound so trite saying be courageous, but certainly be bold and be courageous. And I mean, and that's something I had to deal with too, right? Like, I mean, I am aware that some of the work in here is strange or might, experimental or, be categorized that way. And, that it might go in an editor's trash can, but at the same time, that always hasn't been my experience. One, I use an Excel, actually Microsoft Sheets. I use an online cloud spreadsheet where I keep track of everything. I mean, I know a lot of things aren't submittable, but not everything goes through submittable, right? Some magazines use Gmail, some use other platforms, and I think it's just a good habit to get into where you list what pieces you sent out, where you sent them, what day, the names of all the pieces, and just I think any other information you need. Like I have like a notes column where there's something I need to know. You know, always read the full lit mag page. You know, if they, I mean, most allow simultaneous submissions, but if they don't, that means that poem you're sending is, you can exclusively send it to that one magazine and they might not get back to you for 4 months, right? So I think you have to make choices, but I think a lot of places do allow simultaneous. And I think, send out those, 3 to 5 poem packets. And that's also what's great about poetry is, with the story, you have one story that's kind of going around, but with poetry, you can create a packet of, 5 different poems. I think, usually I will at least, you know, I think at first, you want to spend a lot more time with lit mags, reading them, trying to get their vibe. I think at a certain point, you can kind of skim quickly and be like, oh, my work might be welcome here, or my work's not going to be welcome here, right? And I think you have to understand how valuable your time is. If you're like, this work seems to represent an aesthetic that's very different from mine, and that could be, you're a very traditional poet trying to do something very experimental, or an experimental poet. I mean, and I also understand categories like traditional and experimental are kind of not real, and we all are sort of doing our own experiment at the, we're every time we go to try to write a book, we are all engaging in our own type of experiment. But at the same time, I think you need to sort of be aware where you're like, okay, these people, their taste might not be leaning toward my work. And sometimes that's hard. I mean, especially if magazines are, a lot of these university magazines are print only, they don't have sample work online, and sometimes you just got to take a risk. And I think I took a lot of risks. I mean, there was I posted on Facebook at some point. I went through and looked at, I think it was like in 2019, at the end of the decade, I sort of calculated how many pieces I sent out each year, and how many of those were rejections. And I shared that because I want people to know. And I mean, there was a lot of rejection, right? I mean, for all of those poems, I think only 2 poems in the book weren't published. And one of them, I think I maybe didn't send it out that much. And the other one is like, it's the very end of the book. So it's like, it's the long poem in the book. It's like, I don't know, it's like 20 pages. So long poems are very hard to publish, right? So, and I'm not going to beat myself up over that. And I also think it's nice to have a few pieces in a book that aren't published that people can't just find online, right? It gives someone a reason to buy the book, because everything is just not available elsewhere. But I think it's just being courageous, accepting rejection, being gracious about rejection, understanding it's not personal. That you really, I mean, like, taste is so personalized, and you really can't account for it, especially with like MFA lit journals, which might be changing their masthead every 3 years, every 2 years. So, I mean, that's something I experienced at my MFA. I was at University of Alabama, Black Warrior Review, and there could be like a poetry editor whose taste is hyper experimental and strange, and then something else that maybe they like poetic forms, or they like the lyric, or something that's a little more recognizable. And you can't account for that as someone on the submission end. So all you got to do is just try your hardest and just keep at it.
Yeah, that's brilliant advice because a lot of people are so scared, and it is scary when you're
Mhm.
first submitting. Um, and I wanted
Yes.
to talk about the process of getting this book picked up. Do you have numbers on how many places you submit the book to?
Yes, it's actually, I acknowledge that in the acknowledgments at the very end, uh, because I'm sure people probably, I think I was like, a finalist 3 times, but I entered, I did the contest, I did the open reading periods, I don't know if I should have, but I think at the start, you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know who's going to react to your work or not. So I think, like I said, all you can do is try. Um, I think it was rejected over 70 times. 70.
70. So that means you sent it to at least 71 places.
Right, right. And and I think, and I mean, I was close to putting it in the trunk, as some writers say. And the New Rivers Press came into my email, and they were like, "Is this still available? We'd like to publish this." And it was kind of a wonderful moment. Yeah, something that, and it's a press I've had a really good relationship with so far. So I mean, I'm very grateful for them for taking a risk on this work. And I realize it also, I mean, poetry is its own type of risk, because it's not necessarily fitting into a sort of publishing economy in the same way that, like, the novel is. But at the same time, I mean, like I said, there's so much that just feels chaotic and that you cannot account for. So you just have to, I mean, there's a lot of gumption, and there's also a lot of endurance. I mean, I was definitely at the end of my endurance after, sending a book out like 70 times. But the other thing, which is crazy, is that my short story collection, it was the second time I sent it out, and it won an award. So you never know, right? So it's like, I mean, some part of me, is cautious about saying, I have a book that was rejected 70 times, because I worry about what that communicates about the book as an object, or an object of failure. But also, thematically, failure is a big part of my work, and also transparency is a big part of my work. And I want to be transparent about the process, is that sometimes, if your book is maybe challenging or difficult, or doing something just a little bit out there, you might have a more challenging time getting it picked up. And or I mean, you have to make calls about where you want to go with the work at that point.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because I mean, submitting it to 70 places, that I mean, each place might take 6 months to a year to get back
Mm.
in theory. So I want to remind people because I hear this all the time. People come be like, Kelly, I submit my book out, no one wants it, it sucks, and they sent it to 2 places. And I'm like, okay, but there's more. And I think, like you said, I mean, the book is object. It depends on taste.
Right.
I think in some cases, presses are not financially able to take on work in the same way that they are fiction, like you said, because it's not economically feasible. It's not like you're going to sell a bajillion copies because it's just the market is not the same.
Right, and that's absolutely true. I mean, poetry is already tough to sell on its own, and then, on top of that, something that might be a little bit more challenging to sell or even market, right? uh, I think that is a bigger risk. I was also fortunate that New Rivers Press, although I think, unfortunately, this program might be coming to an end. Part of the concept of my press was that it was run through a university, and they had like a publishing class where undergraduate students worked on my book. And I think that it's probably probably like an interesting book for some of them, I think, to get to work on, as it might be a little bit different from other books. Maybe it was a whole set of books. I don't know what the process was like, but the undergraduate students were amazing. I enjoyed communicating with them, talking to them, and I think that's something that's interesting too. So maybe my book came out of the need for a teachable moment, but that's good enough for me. I
No,
mean, it's
it's
getting
beautiful. You
published,
did a
right?
great job. I think that's an amazing program, and I think they really did something cool with it. And so in your book, we're almost getting to the end of our conversation, but I know you mentioned tarot cards and a lot of it. And I wanted to see if you could pull a card for Telltale.
Pull a card. I could.
Yes.
Uh, let me go get one of I have many tarot decks. So I'll be right back.
Okay, while he waits, I'll do a little dance. While we wait. This is the tarot waiting dance.
Okay, I am back. I have I just pulled one at random. I have the Very Little Tarot deck by Trungles, who I have not read it yet. He has a sort of young adult graphic novel called The Magic Fish. I love his art so much, and um, just don't ask me what the card means in a vacuum, because the cards are in conversation with each other, so I don't know how much I could say about one card on its own. But also, I do have my other, it's the old version, but there was Funerals and Thrones, my other chapbook. It was mainly tarot poems. So some of those tarot poems came out of this chapbook that was more about the tarot. Okay, I'm done shuffling. I'm just going to sort of pick one from the center. We have the Page of Coins.
Oh, it's so cute.
A bunny for this one, the Page of Coins. So perhaps a person. I don't know if it's a person in my life or a person in your life, Callie, but who is the Page of Coins?
What does it mean? Oh my God, I must know my future.
I think the intent. I feel like we didn't have a question. I feel like
Okay, here's my question. Okay. Oh wait, I have to ask a yes or no question. How do I do it?
I don't. I mean, well, I don't. I'm trying to think of. I feel like usually, I mean, there's a context to the cards, and but I think something that's sort of interesting about the Page of Coins can sort of see that it does have to do with a lot with like youth, students, changing professions, sort of changing a line of work, taking on more responsibility. So maybe there is a way to sort of tie the Page of Coins into this entire Q&A or talk, where we're sort of encouraging people to go forth and publish them. What's that?
I said JD and Telltale start a teaching program? What?
Right. I mean, right? So maybe the Page of Coins is just if anyone feels inspired by our talk to go out and feels adventurous enough to send their work out, or even try to put together a manuscript and send that out. Maybe this is the signal for it's time to make that big change. It's time to reinvent yourself and sort of take that next step as a writer.
Oh, I love that idea. It's a sign. If you are looking, here it is. JD, this was awesome. I love your book. I love chatting with you. I will be I will be asking for a list of recommended books that you suggest people read. And do you have anything else you want to share before I let you enjoy your Wednesday?
No, thank you so much for having me. And I'm so grateful that you found some interest and value in my work. I should say that maybe I'll do the final plug, is that Mask for Mask is out from New Rivers Press on April 6th. So actually 2 weeks from yesterday. I don't know when this will go live. It might already be out by the time this goes live. I'm not sure. But you can also find me at jdscott.com. There's a tab on the left for Mask for Mask. You can find all the information about it. I've also created a link tree with all the links where you can buy it. It's, I think, anywhere you can buy a book online. I think at this point it's my distributors shuffling it into the fold, so you should find it easily. But yes, that's my book plug. Thank you for having me.
Yes, and if anyone is thinking about starting an author website, I was really impressed with yours because you have, your bio was easily available, your press kit, like everything was there that anyone would need. So that's something to consider if you're watching this and you're thinking, how do I market my book? Follow JD. And yeah, I'll talk to you soon.